Hey, crime family. Welcome to our very first episode of True Crime.
State of Mind. And I'm Andrea.
I'm Brooke. And we are sisters from another mister. We're sisters-in-law. I've been married to Andrea's brother for 17 and a half years now. Holy cow.
Crazy.
And so this episode is going to be from Ogden, Utah, which is our hometown. We don't live there anymore, so don't try to triangulate. It's from our hometown, Ogden, Utah, the Hi-Fi murders. We chose this case because we kind of grew up with this case. It happened before either of us were born. But we grew up with hearing about it from our parents, anniversaries, different newspaper articles, news stories on TV, things like that. There are a lot of other cases in Utah that we chose not to do. Very famous cases like Susan Powell and Elizabeth Smart. Susan Powell we actually have ties to because they believe that her body may have been dumped out in the West Desert, and my husband actually owns mines out in the West Desert, and the police actually even talked to him about checking out his mines and trying to find her, and they did actually search his mines for several days, but never came up with anything. Decided not to do those. They're also both very heavily covered. Susan Powell has a really, really good podcast. It's actually the first podcast I ever listened to. It's called Cold. It's very in-depth. It's like 9 episodes. It's so good. So I didn't think we should cover that one, so we decided on the Hi-Fi murders. So I like really spooky things because my birthday is Day of the Dead, which is November 2nd. And I hated it when I was younger because it was close to a holiday. It was close to Halloween. And so my birthday parties were usually dress-up birthday parties because they were usually on or near Halloween. So I hated it when I was younger. And I didn't know what Day of the Dead was. I just knew it was on the calendar on my birthday. So then as I got older, I kind of embraced it. Like, oh, Day of the Dead. It's such a cool holiday. And so I love the Mexican culture. And it's just so... And then Coco came out, and now everybody knows what Day of the Dead is.
That's so true.
And it's also such a good movie. I cry every time. Grandma's, why do they have to die?
Same.
So, very, very good movie. So, yeah, I love horror movies. We're actually going to go see Scream today, the brand new Scream.
So excited.
It just came out yesterday, so we're super, super excited to go see it. And so yeah, that's why I like spooky things.
And I like spooky things because when I was younger, I had to kind of teach myself how to like scary movies because I had night terrors and I was that kid that was always standing at the foot of my parents' bed, terrified because I watched an episode of Unsolved Mysteries.
Oh, good old Unsolved Mysteries.
So Scream was actually the first horror movie I ever forced myself to watch all the way through.
Oh, nice.
So it's kind of in a full circle at
You were
this
pretty
point.
young because I think I was only like 16.
Yeah.
And you're younger than me, so it was like you were like 15.
Yeah, but at 15, come on, you shouldn't be scared
yeah,
of
but
horror
it was
movies.
rated R. I mean,
true. My family, yeah, that didn't really matter too much.
Right,
but
same.
The Simpsons, for some reason, we couldn't watch.
I watched The Simpsons.
But so I forced myself to watch a lot of horror movies, and then I just slowly got into true crime and podcasts and all that fun stuff, and now I'm obsessed. I can't imagine not starting something like this. So I'm really excited that we're doing it together. Whether it goes anywhere or not, we just want to entertain people. So that's kind of why.
And get some time hanging out together.
Yeah, because that never happens. We
live
live
an hour apart from each other, so
but
sometimes very often.
Sometimes it seems so much longer than an hour.
It does, yeah.
Just because of traffic. So
right.
yeah, but we're excited to move in this direction because of our excitement, mutual love
of
for
true crime.
Creepy, morbid stuff.
I'm always sending Andrea movies and newspaper clippings, and she's always sending me, oh, you gotta listen to this podcast, and oh, we need to go see this movie when it comes out, which Scream was one of them, so I'm super excited. All right, so I'm going to tell you about the victims. So this is for the Hi-Fi murders in Ogden, Utah. So we have 5 victims. We have Byron Courtney Nesbitt. He goes by Courtney because his dad's name is also Byron Courtney Nesbitt. And his dad was also Byron Courtney Nesbitt. So Courtney's actually like the third. He was 16 years old. He was going to Ogden High School at the time. So apparently my mother-in-law was going to high school at the time as well. So she's 2 years older than him, but she was also going to Ogden High at the same time. And Ogden High is this beautiful building in Ogden, and it looks like a castle from the outside, and the inside's like all marble, and they've actually used it in a few movies. It's just beautiful. I didn't go there.
But it's like a historic building now,
right?
So it has to be like restored to its original beauty.
And it's been restored a few times. Like they've done some work to it, but it's still, it's just beautiful. Anyways, he was working on his pilot's license, and the day of the incident, he'd actually flown solo for the first time. So he was super excited to get home and tell his family about it. And then we have Carol Nesbitt, which is Courtney's mom. She was 52 at the time. She was married to Courtney's dad, Dr. Byron Nesbitt, for 32 years at this point. So, holy hell, that's a long time.
Yes, it is.
And he actually kind of recently just barely passed away. He died in 2020 at the age of 97.
97?
Right?
I honestly didn't know.
Yes.
I didn't know he lived that long. That's crazy.
Is one whole life.
That's crazy.
And he was an OBGYN, and he delivered thousands of babies in Ogden. I believe he worked at the McKay Hospital, which at the time of the incident was called McKay. So he worked there, and so Carol, she attended University of Utah. Go Utes! That's where I went. And also Utah State. She had 4 kids. She had 3 sons and a daughter, and Courtney is the youngest, and he was the only one still left at home. Sherry Michelle Ansley was 18 years old. Just 2 weeks before the crime, she became engaged, and so she actually got the job to pay for her wedding that was upcoming. So this was in April, and she was supposed to get married in August. Oh. But she was a senior in high school, so she got engaged in high school.
I mean, it is Utah.
Right? Like, we like to get married young here. I'm just saying. I mean, I was 22, but... and that was old, you guys.
I'm really old. I'm just a spinster now. So it's fine.
It's fine. She's my spinster sister. It's cool. So she had actually only worked at the hi-fi shop for 1 week when this happened. And like I said, she got the job so she could pay for her wedding. And she was a bookkeeper and a cashier. 2 very different things. I'm surprised. And only 18. And they hired her as a bookkeeper. But whatever. And she was going to Bonneville High School. So that's where I went to high school. So go Lakers as well. And then we have Stanley Walker, who was 20 years old. He graduated from Ben Lomond High.
That's where I went to school.
Scots. And then he began attending Weber State in 1973. And Weber State at the time was Weber State College. Now it's Weber State University. Mm-hmm. And he was a basketball coach for his church. So that's kind of fun. And then his dad, Orrin Walker, he was 43 at the time. He was an amateur ham radio operator, which I thought was kind of fun because my husband also is an amateur ham radio operator. Like, super amateur, but you know. It's fun. It's a hobby. It's a hobby. Nerdy hobby, but it's a hobby. My husband's a nerd, guys. It's all right. And then he also owned, ironically, Walker Radio and Electronics, which is ironic because the hi-fi shop where this happened is kind of the same thing. Like, they're both like electronic stores, which is weird. And why does his son not work at his store? Why did his son work at the other store?
That's the whole thing I've been wondering.
Right?
Like,
that's so weird. Thing. But he was like a manager, so Stanley was a manager at the hi-fi store. So, I don't know, maybe he didn't even want his own son to be a manager at his store.
Truth. That might be it.
Could be. He also worked at Hill Air Force Base. I don't know what he did there. I just know he worked at Hill Air Force Base. There's thousands of people who work at Hill Air Force Base, though. So, and he had 2 sons, including Stanley, and he had been married at the time of the crime for 23 years. So now Andrea is going to tell you about the perpetrators.
All right, guys. So we have 2 people that were persons of interest in this case, but there was also a third guy that I'll touch on a little bit. But the first guy we're going to talk about is Dale Pierre Shelby. Now, Shelby was born in Tobago in 1952, but then quickly grew up or moved to Trinidad, and that's where he actually grew up. He was always getting in trouble growing up. His family was definitely trying to do right by him, but he was just a troublemaker. he couldn't seem to get on the straight and narrow. In 1970, I think that he was looking for a change in life, and he actually moved to the United States. He was actually in Brooklyn, New York, until 1973. So there's not a lot of information about what he was doing during that time, but in 1973 is when he joined the Air Force, and then he was stationed at Hill Air Force Base, which is what Brooke was talking about before. It's a huge Air Force base here in Utah, and thousands and thousands of people work there. The Hi-Fi murders were not like the only thing that he was accused of taking part in. He actually was accused of another murder, which happened to be a sergeant at Hill Air Force Base at the time. He was actually found in his apartment, murdered by a bayonet. So
yikes.
Yeah, it's kind of the history on this is pretty crazy. Honestly, what they were saying is Pierre was over at this guy's apartment. His last name is Jefferson. Edward Jefferson, sorry, okay. Was his name. Sorry. Pierre was over at his house not too long before this, and Jefferson was missing his keys. And so what they think happened is Pierre stole his keys and made copies of them using an alias. And he
has a lot of aliases too. Like, so his name is Dale Shelby Pierre, but when he changes his name constantly. Yeah. Sometimes he goes by Dale, sometimes he goes by Shelby, sometimes he goes by Pierre. Sometimes he switches them, and he's Pierre Dale Shelby.
I know, it's crazy. Right? So all my research had that, so I'm just going to refer to him as Pierre during this. He went and made, allegedly, I should say, made keys with an alias, and he ended up returning the other keys, or so they say, and Jefferson found them, and all was well. But he was instantly already suspecting Pierre, because Pierre was, he was just kind of, nobody liked him on the base. He didn't have any friends. People were afraid of him for good reason.
Yeah, he killed a guy with a bayonet.
Yeah. Allegedly.
Allegedly.
Okay, we can't say he did. He was never convicted.
The thing is, like, a bayonet is on the end of a gun.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. What? Why? Why not use the gun?
Maybe he didn't have any bullets, bro.
I mean, quite possible.
Okay.
A bayonet would be quieter, too, I guess.
I mean, yeah, you didn't want to get caught doing it.
Right.
But honestly, like, this whole situation is so crazy. When Jefferson's body was found, he was obviously murdered, and they jumped quickly to Pierre and started questioning him about it. When confronted by the police, Pierre denied everything, of course. And he was talking about how during the time of the murder that he had like 3 different alibis for this time, and none of them checked out. But during this time, the police obviously didn't want to let him go. This is a very violent crime. Mm-hmm. From my research, hearing about it, they said the perpetrator of that crime, they jammed the long knife with such velocity into his head that only the handle could be seen. Ooh. So that's how far the bayonet was in this poor
man's. The bayonets are long. Probably like 10 inches.
Yeah.
I mean, they're long.
Yeah. It's the craziest thing I've ever heard of. Like, I mean, obviously I've heard of a lot of crazy things. So right. Let's not say ever.
And yeah, we'll go into a lot of those, I'm sure.
I mean, I'm just moving into this crime in itself. Right. We're going to get there. But, after interviewing dozens of witnesses and researching the name, unfortunately, there wasn't enough evidence to convict. Like, everybody knew he did it. Everybody knew that he was this bad dude. Nobody wanted to be friends with him for good reason. Their hair on the back of their neck stood up when they were around him. But they couldn't. It was all circumstantial. They couldn't pinpoint anything. Now, if this crime happened today, he would for sure be in prison because of it. Because of all the DNA and forensics that we do have now. They didn't have it then. So, we'll get into William Andrews now, because Pierre, man, you've heard enough about him for now. William Andrews was actually born in Virginia in 1953. childhood was normal. From what I've read about him, he was always trying to fit in. He wanted to be like
a follower.
Yeah, he was definitely a follower. He wanted to fit in. He wanted to have friends, which he had plenty of on base. So he lost a lot of his friends, like on Hill Air Force Base. He lost a lot of his friends once he started hanging out with Pierre because people were creeped out.
Right.
They didn't want to be around him. So against all odds, Pierre and Andrews became great friends in the worst way. So in March 1974, both the men filed for separation from the base, from the Air Force.
I didn't know that.
And so it's kind of crazy.
In 74, you said?
1974.
So in the same year
yeah, same
that
year.
the crime happened.
So they're still in the military. Obviously, that's where they found them in their barracks or on the base and all of that. But yeah, their commanding officer, it always seemed that Andrews was basically a follower, as I mentioned before. He wanted to, be a part of the, as he thought of it, the cool kids club. And that Pierre, he was obviously the person that had the uncontrollable rage. So he was the leader.
Yeah, so everybody wants to be friends with him.
I mean, who wouldn't want a friend with uncontrollable rage? I mean,
right?
You gotta have one, friends. You gotta have one. So, yes.
All right, so now we get into the nitty-gritty of the actual crime. So, on April 22nd, Earth Day, 1974, I only know that because it's also my sister's birthday, 6 men arrived in 2 vans in the hi-fi shop located at 2323 Washington Boulevard in Ogden, Utah, just before it closed. So, now the hi-fi shop isn't there anymore. They actually tore it down while after this happened. I don't think it was immediate. It was a little while later. They just tore it down and built another strip mall. And from what I could find on Google Maps, it looks like it's Weber State University fan store. So you can buy like jerseys and t-shirts and lanyards and stuff there for Weber State.
And delicious coffee.
And delicious coffee, Andrea says. So that's what's there now, but this place isn't there anymore. So 3 of the 6 men entered the store with guns, and the other 3 stayed in the vans outside. So 2 employees were in the store at the time. So Stanley Walker, who was 20, and she goes by Michelle Ansley. Her first name's actually Sherry, but she goes by Michelle. And she was 18. They were taken hostage into the store's basement, which is weird that a store has a basement, but I was like, stores have basements?
That actually is. I mean, in Ogden, actually, I think.
Oh, yeah, because, so where this is kind of, so, I mean, legend has it. There's like a whole tunnel system underground because of Prohibition. So, 25th Street is where that is, and this is 2323, so it's about that area. So, I mean, they probably all had connecting tunnels under there, Kind of cool and spooky.
Yes.
So they were taken hostage downstairs into the basement, and Pierre and Andrews bound them while everybody else was robbing the store. So Pierre was only 21 when this happened, and Andrews was only 19. Like, it sounded like from their history that they were a lot older, but they were young.
Yeah.
They were super young. So 3 of the men that came to the robbery left in one of the vans. Like, they loaded it up, they left in one of the vans. So those 3 men were never charged with anything. They never even police never found out who they were. The perpetrators never named them, but they just know that there were 6 people there. So in the meantime, Courtney Nesbitt was running an errand for his parents. So his parents had just gotten back from Hong Kong, and they had taken a new camera with them. And one of Courtney's brothers had set the camera to I believe it's the aperture. They had it set at 400. I don't know cameras, guys. Sorry, not fancy cameras. I know cell phone cameras. So he had it set at a certain thing, and when they got back, he's looking at the camera and he's like, "Oh no, you had moved this to a different number," and so the pictures wouldn't come out correctly. They would come out super dark. So they were like, "Oh, we need to take it to a Photoshop to have them developed correctly." But it was right next door to the hi-fi shop. So Courtney is at flight school, and he just has flight school right after high school, like when high school lets out for the day. So he's at flight school, and he gets to do his first solo flight, and it's amazing, and he loves it, and he's so super excited to go home and tell his parents about it. And his brother is staying for dinner that night, because Courtney's the only one who still lives at home. So his brother, or his mom tells his brother, hey, those pictures are ready. Will you go get them? And his brother's like, oh, I don't know. I don't really, like, I'm already here. I don't want to leave. So he's like, oh, Courtney is kind of near there at the flight school at the Ogden airport. So I'm going to call him at the flight school because remember, this is 1974. No cell phones.
Yeah.
So he calls the flight school and he does get a hold of Courtney as Courtney's like on his way out the door. And he's like, hey, Courtney, can you go pick up these pictures? And Courtney's like, it's rush hour. I'm going to find nowhere to park and this is going to suck. And he's like, you know what? If there's nowhere to park, just park at the hi-fi shop next door because it's almost closed. There won't be a lot of people there. And they're friends. I think they're family friends with Stanley.
Yeah.
So they knew Stanley. So they were like, you know, just go park behind the hi-fi shop and you can run next door and pick up the pictures. So he's like, okay, fine. I'll go do it. So, and he was 16 at the time. So he goes to the hi-fi shop, parks in the back, walks through the back door of this shop and says hi to Michelle and Stanley. It's like, hey, is it okay if I park here while I run next door real quick? And so they're like, yeah, sure, man, whatever. So he goes and he picks up the photos. And when he comes back, by the time he comes back, the hi-fi shop is closed. And the lights are all off, but the front door's unlocked. So he goes in the front door and he's like, hey, Stanley, thanks for letting me park here. And then he's like, yeah, hello? Like, the lights are out, but the door's unlocked. What's going on? So he walks towards the back of the store to go out the back door, and he's met by Pierre with a gun to his head. And Stanley's standing there as well, and Stanley says, he has a gun, and Courtney's like, what's going on? And then Pierre punches Courtney. And I've seen two different things where either he punched him in the stomach or he punched him in the groin. Something happened where he was, like, incapacitated, and they basically dragged him down the stairs and bound him as well, which Michelle was already downstairs. So then Orrin Walker shows up because he picks up Stanley from work every day. And I don't know why. He's 20 years old.
I mean, when I was 20, I never wanted my parents to pick me up from work.
Right?
So
I was like, maybe he doesn't have a
70s.
driver's license. Maybe he didn't have a car. I don't know. But his dad always picked him up. So his dad's waiting outside, and he's like, come on, Stanley. What's taking so long? This is taking forever. And he finally goes inside looking for him. And of course, he is also confronted by Pierre with the gun. I don't know if Pierre's just like standing at the back door with a gun.
And that's honestly what it sounds
right?
like at
Because
this
everybody
point.
who comes in, like, he's standing at the door with a gun, like, just waiting for people. I don't know. So Orrin comes in and he's looking for Stanley, and then he ends up down in the basement as well with everybody else. So then Carol Nesbitt, which is Courtney's mom, she's home. She's 52. And she's thinking, okay, Courtney went to flight school, then he went to pick up the pictures. He should have been home an hour ago. So she's talking to her husband and her other son who's there for dinner. And she's like, okay, we've already eaten dinner. He's still not home. What is going on? And her husband kind of gets angry with her. He's like, well, it's been an hour. Like, he said he had a paper he had to write. He probably just went to the library, or he's hanging out with friends, or maybe he got caught up talking to Stanley at the hi-fi shop. Like, he'll be home soon. And she says, no, I know my kid. He would have called me to tell me he's going to be late. And her husband's like, you're so overprotective. Like, this is why we went to Hong Kong, so you'd stop worrying about the kids. You're constantly worrying about the kids. And she just kind of is like, ugh, I'm going to go look for him. And he's like, well, I can't leave. Because remember, he's an OBGYN, and he's on call.
Right.
Like, always. So he can't leave because there are no cell phones. At this time, I don't even think there's pagers. 1970s? Probably not.
I'll have to look that up.
I don't know. So, I mean, they call him at his home to tell him that, somebody's going to have a baby. Come to the hospital.
Yeah.
So he's like, I can't leave. I got to stay here. And she kind of looks at her other son like, hey, you want to come with me? And her other son's like, don't look at me. Like, I think you're also an overprotective mom. Like, this is a lot for only an hour late. And she's like, I just have this feeling. So she goes off and she goes to try to find Courtney. So she goes to the flight school, and the flight school's closed. So then she goes to the library because she's like, oh, maybe he's at the library. Well, his friend that was in the flight school with him was at the library, and he had actually skipped flight school that day because he had the same paper to write that Courtney had to write. So she runs into him at the library, and she says, oh, have you seen Courtney? And he says, nah, I mean, I saw him at school, but he went to flight school. I didn't go to flight school, so I don't know where he is. So she's like, okay, the only other place I can think of is at the photo shop. So she goes over to the photo shop. It's closed now because it's like getting dark at this point. And so she goes to the photo shop. It's closed. So drives around the back to the parking lot and sees Courtney's car. And he drives a really cute little Beetle, by the way.
Love
Because
Beetles.
it's the 70s. I mean, come on. And so she sees his car, and so she's like, oh, he's still here. I'm like, oh, that dang Courtney. He just got talking to Stanley and lost track of time. So she goes in the door, and again is met by Pierre with a gun. And he says, what are you doing here, lady? And she says, I'm looking for my son, like really loud. Where's Courtney? Is he okay? Is he okay? Where is he? You know? So he drags her downstairs where she sees Courtney, and they're all bound. So they all have like, I don't know if I think I read that they were tied by rope. So they were tied by rope with their hands and their legs tied. So they're all kind of like laying on the floor, kind of awkwardly laying on the floor. And so now we have all 5 victims downstairs. So we have the original, which was Michelle and Stanley. And then we have Courtney, who came in afterwards. Then Orrin, who came in looking for Stanley. And then Carol, who came in looking for Courtney. So now they're all downstairs in the basement. And see, so now, the night before, Pierre and Andrews had watched a movie on Hill Air Force Base. They both are at Hill Air Force Base. And they showed a movie, and it's called Magnum Force. I've never seen it, and I don't even know what the premise is of it. But in the movie, there's a scene where there's a sex worker who's leaving a hotel, and she gets in a taxi cab. And for some reason, her pimp is apparently mad at her. And he gets in the taxi cab as well. So they're in the backseat of the taxi cab, and they're driving, and the pimp is mad at the sex worker. And so he starts kind of beating on her. And so the taxi driver pulls over and jumps out of the car and runs away. Because that's what you do. And the pimp pulls Drano out of his pocket and pours it down her throat. And she dies pretty much instantly. Like, she's kind of gasping and whatnot, but she dies pretty much instantly. So I've seen 2 different scenarios. I've seen, in some sources, it says that Pierre and Andrews brought the Drano with them, and it was in the van, so they had intended on killing people. Or I've also seen that Pierre, from Pierre's mouth himself, he's quoted as saying that he went to the restroom in the hi-fi shop, saw the Drano there, remembered the movie from the night before, and thought, this will be a quiet, easy way to kill them. Like, no gunshots, nothing. You know, nobody will hear it. So he puts the Drano in a paper bag. That's for sure. So he puts the Drano in a paper bag, and he's pouring it into cups. And he says, he's telling them, like, telling them he's going to make them drink it. And they're like, well, what's in it? And he's, like, kind of laughing and smirking and saying, oh, it's a German drug, and it's just going to put you guys to sleep so we can rob the place, and then you'll wake up when we're gone.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
What in the world?
I know. Horrible. So he pours the first one, and Orrin, for some reason, Orrin's not tied up. He's, like, down there, and he's being held at gunpoint, but he's not tied up. So he's handing the drinks to Orrin, and he's telling Orrin, you have to pass these around to everybody. And Orrin refuses. He's like, oh, hell no, I'm not giving him this thing. I don't know what it is. Yeah. So he's like, I'm not giving him this. And so Pierre gets mad at him and kind of like throws him down on the ground and then binds him. So now he's kind of like face down on the ground and he's bound. Arms behind his back and then his ankles tied together. And so then he starts kind of sitting up the hostages and force feeding them this Drano. But the problem is that the Drano is like, they're just kind of sputtering and spitting it out. And it's instantaneous. The blisters on their mouths. Oh, I can only imagine.
It's like, it has to be like the worst thing
ever. Like so torturous.
Yeah.
So he's like feeding them this Drano. And they're kind of like convulsing and they're kind of sputtering and spitting it out. And they're getting blisters on their mouths. But they're not dying. They're not dying right away. So Pierre's kind of getting frustrated, and he's like, well, I wonder if I poured it down their mouth and then put duct tape on their mouth, if that would keep it in their mouth, and then they would just die.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But the problem is he puts the duct tape on their mouth, but their mouth is so, like, blistered and wet.
Well, it's like it can be slimy. Like,
right?
If you've ever touched Drano, it's like slimy.
Right? It is, yeah. So the duct tape won't stick to, and duct tape sticks to everything, guys.
Everything.
I mean,
everything.
literally, my real job is that I'm a duct tape crafter. I make stuff out of duct tape. It sticks to everything. And it wouldn't stick to their faces because their faces were so, like, blistered and slimy and ugh. And so it wouldn't stick. So he was frustrated again. And he's like, okay, these guys aren't dying. So he force feeds them all the Drano. And then he gets to Oren, who was the one who refused to feed the Drano to the other people. And he's kind of forcing it down his throat, but he sees what's happening to everybody else as they're drinking this Drano. So he just kind of lets it kind of sit in his mouth, but then lets it out. Like, he doesn't swallow it. He just kind of lets it dribble out as it's going in, which still is causing those burns around his mouth.
Yeah.
But he's not swallowing it. And then he kind of fakes the, like, convulsions that everybody else is doing. Oh, can you imagine the convulsions?
Yeah. Oh, no.
So he kind of fakes it. So then they're kind of just standing around them, and Pierre is getting pissed that this is taking too long. Like, it's taking too long. They're not dying fast enough. So he's like, hey, haha, I've got a gun. Yeah. Why don't I just shoot? Because he's like, okay, we've got the bands loaded up. We just want to get out of here. But at the same time, he's like, we have all these hostages, and we've already tortured them with Drano, and they can identify us. And Oren's like, we won't identify you. We won't identify you. And of course, Dale is like, sure you won't anyway. So he picks up Carol and he shoots her in the back of the head. And Courtney saw this. His son, her son saw this. And then he tried to shoot Oren, but he missed. So he shot at Oren, but he missed. So then he made Oren watch while he shot Stanley, and which is his son.
That is the
and
so
in the
horrible.
back of the head, like literally just like they're laying on the ground, picks them up and shoots them in the back of the head. So then he shoots at Oren again, but he only grazes his head, so he's still bleeding. So it looks like maybe he shot him, but he didn't. He just grazed him. So then he took Michelle to the far corner of the basement, out of eyesight of everybody else, and he forces her at gunpoint to remove her clothes, and then he repeatedly raped her. And at one point, he tells Andrews to leave so he can rape her. And then at another point, Andrews comes back and watches him rape her.
Well, that's...
So, you.
that's really creepy.
Right?
And...
so creepy. And the surviving hostages, by the way, there are survivors. So that's, the light at the end of the tunnel, I guess. So the surviving hostages... Actually, they didn't know for sure that that's what he was doing. They just kind of assumed because they could hear her pleading for her life and saying, I'm too young to die. Like, please just leave me alone. I'm too young. But when they brought her back to everybody, she was still naked. So Courtney even later said, like, I couldn't stop staring because he's 16.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, and she's got the blisters all around her mouth from the Drano and everything. Ugh. So,
that's horrible.
So he brought her back to everybody, and she was naked, and he threw her down on the ground and shot her in the back of the head after raping her repeatedly. So he's a special kind of monster. Yeah. And Oren later testified, because he's one of the survivors, so he later testified at the trial that her last words were, I'm too young to die. How heartbreaking is that?
That is really heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. So, at this point, the would-be robbers turned murderers realized that Oren's still alive. Like, they shot him twice. They shot at him, missed, shot at him again, and grazed him. And they realized he's still alive. But he's kind of playing dead. Like, he's kind of laying, and he's like, no, I'm dead. And so, whose mind goes here but a monster? So Pierre goes and grabs a ballpoint pen, sticks it in Oren's ear, and literally stomps it into his ear until it comes out the other side of his neck.
Oh.
So it, like, broke. Like, it hit bone, and the pen broke, and then went out the side of his neck. And I could not find anywhere if, like, what Oren went through afterwards, like, if he was deaf or anything. I don't think he was. I think it hurt him, but he had obviously severe trauma and horrible injuries, but he didn't, like, there was no lasting effects of the pen to the ear.
Oh, that's like, just to picture it, like,
I know,
gives me the chills.
And later too, when they go get, like, the cops arrive and they go get the hostages, one of the cops even says, like, I'll never get the image of Oren walking around with a pen hanging out of his ear.
Gosh.
Like, just the tip of the pen. Oh, and the other side of the pen out of his neck. Like, oh, that's crazy.
Oh my gosh.
So then Dale and Pierre and Andrews realized that, okay, these guys are all dead. We've killed them all. So they go upstairs. And they finish loading all of the equipment into the van, which was driven by Keith Roberts. So he's one of the perpetrators, but he didn't even know any of this was going on. He didn't know that anybody was being killed. He never went into the store. He literally just sat outside in the van waiting for them. Okay, so Courtney and Orrin, they both survived. So it's the 16-year-old and then Orrin, which is Stanley's father, both survived. Carol was actually alive when the police arrived. And she actually went to the hospital with Courtney. But she was pronounced dead at the scene. So I watched the movie. The movie's really awful. Don't go watch it.
Yeah, stay away.
The book was amazing. Read Victim. It was awesome. But the movie was awful. But in the movie, they said something about how Carol was still alive, but they were like, we need to focus on Courtney, and he's more viable than she is. So they just kind of, I don't want to say let her die, but they were like, I don't think there's anything we can do. But that's how the movie was, but they did not mention that in the book or in any articles I read. So I think that was just theatrical. I think she actually was just pronounced dead when they got to the scene.
Yeah.
Because she was shot in the back of the head, and force-fed Drano, so she had blisters all over her face. But afterwards, Courtney did survive. He spent 266 consecutive days in the hospital. That's like 2/3 of a year.
Yeah, that's
basically.
what I was gonna say. It's basically almost an entire year.
Right? And the ironic thing is, he was shot in the back of the head, and the bullet did less damage than the Drano did to him.
That's crazy.
Right? So the Drano did more damage because it literally dissolved like his esophagus, his throat. He had a hard time breathing. He couldn't eat. They actually ended up rebuilding his esophagus with like this groundbreaking surgery where this guy, this like well-known surgeon, actually took part of his colon out and used part of his colon to make an esophagus, which is crazy. So he survived. I mean, at first he had amnesia. He did not testify at the trial because he did not remember any of it, but slowly started remembering things, especially once he finally was told that his mother had died. He actually this whole time thought his mother was alive because psychologists were called in and they told Dr. Nesbitt, which is Courtney's father, don't tell him his mom's dead unless he specifically asks you if she's alive. Don't tell him.
Well, it makes sense,
right?
In the situation that he's in.
You need to focus on you. You need to feel better. You know, we need to get you healthy,
right?
And all that. So he actually didn't know for a while. I mean, it was a long time. It was almost a year, I believe, until he finally knew that his mom had actually died. But he didn't remember a lot of it. But eventually he did. He said he remembered parts of it. He remembered his mom coming to the store and hearing her up at the top of the stairs. He remembered seeing his mom shot in the head, which is awful. And he did not remember the Drano. He did remember seeing Michelle naked because he's a 16-year-old boy.
That was fresh in the mind.
So he had a lot of surgeries. He was constantly going back and forth to the hospital. He never was able to get his pilot's license. He never flew a plane again, which is really sad.
That's really sad.
Mm-hmm. That's rough.
Yeah.
He did actually graduate from Ogden High with his class, 1976. So 2 years later. So he was in chronic pain for the rest of his life. He died pretty young. He died at 44 years old. He did get married. So he was married to Catherine Hunter in 1985. So that would have been 11 years after the crime. Orrin did testify at the court. And he walked away with severe burns to his lips and mouth and trauma to his ear. But I couldn't find anything about like if he had any hearing problems or anything like that. He was able to walk, talk, and attend church. He did have a bright pink scar on his forehead from the grazing of the bullet, so head wounds bleed really bad. So I'm sure they thought they actually had shot him in the head. And he later died in 2000 of cancer, and he was 69 years old.
Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit into the investigation. So right after the crime, Orrin Walker was able to give a description to the police of the suspects, and it sparked a statewide manhunt. Now, we have to remember back in the 70s, there was a lot of racial profiling going on. So a lot of the articles that I did read, they definitely touched on this. So I want to make sure that I'm, tackling that part of it. Because I know the whole Black community had a really tough time during this, and they all felt like they were on trial.
Well, and if, for those of you that aren't from Utah, Utah's a very white state.
Very white.
So if you were a black person at this time, like, yeah, that must have been really hard because it was like any black male. They were like any black male. They were stopping them and questioning them.
Right, and that's kind of what it was. Every car that had more than one black person in the vehicle was getting pulled over. Oh. And so, I mean, that's just, you know, a very sad statement.
Right.
So a lot of what I was reading, there was a teacher and her son actually got pulled over by the cops for nothing more than just driving while black.
That's
so
awful.
It was like one of those situations where I think a lot of the teaching your sons at an early age and your daughters at an early age what they need to do when they approach a police officer. It's just sad that we're still seeing that
still
in 2022.
50 years later.
Like, how is this still happening?
Right.
As you'll learn, Brooke and I are allies for everybody.
Yes.
So
for sure.
You'll definitely hear a lot of that coming from us. But getting back a little bit into the investigation, an Air Force officer called Ogden City Police and told them that months earlier, an airman confided in him that one of these days I'm going to rob that hi-fi shop.
Ooh.
And if anyone gets in my way, I'm going to kill them.
Nice.
So
but the ironic thing is these guys weren't in their way. Yeah. Like, they were, like, literally just in the basement. They could have just left.
Yeah. Like, what would you rather go to jail for?
Robbing or... I mean, they did rob $25,000 worth of merchandise, so it would have been a felony, but it still wouldn't have been life in prison. Or execution.
Execution, straight up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a crazy situation, but they could have let him go.
Right.
And they were there to kill people at this point.
Yes.
Obviously, with the heinous acts that they did on these people. Anyway, but it's just a crazy situation to know that this officer never stepped, or this Hill Air Force Base officer never stepped up and mentioned something like this. Especially when it's coming from somebody that nobody liked, Pierre. Nobody liked him. Everybody was afraid of him. He should have taken that seriously. Not to blame that officer by any means. But,
right. He didn't do the crime.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Shoulda, coulda, woulda.
Yeah.
So, a few hours later, after that call was received, a couple of teenage boys searching dumpsters for bottles to recycle, they actually discovered the victims' wallets and purses.
So not only did they kill them and rob the store, they also took their purses.
Yeah.
And wallets.
And threw them on the Air Force Base that they
just threw them away.
And they work there. They work and live there.
Yeah.
On the base.
Uh-huh.
So
they're super smart.
They had a plan, guys. They had a plan.
And it was working out. I'm glad it didn't, though.
No.
I mean.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but something could have went into play earlier, and maybe this would have been prevented. But when police showed up at Hill Air Force Base to investigate, all the crowds and the airmen, they all started to form around, interested in what's going on. Most of them were really calm, and they were just curious. Nobody visibly was nervous, except for two guys.
Ooh, I wonder who they could be.
These two guys were pacing, talking really loudly, kind of freaking out a little bit. They were really anxious. Physically, they were sweating. And so the police decided, hey, let's see if we can rattle more people. So they started pulling out evidence from the dumpster with tongs and like loudly saying what it is and like showing it off to the audience.
That's smart, actually.
You could just see, obviously, Pierre and Andrews getting more and more like flustered. And so their behavior obviously got them arrested or brought in for an interview.
Don't be suspicious. Don't be suspicious.
Yeah. they probably were singing that in their head. Right. I'm not being suspicious. You're being suspicious. I mean, come on. But, so later these two men obviously were identified as Pierre, Dale Shelby, and William Andrews. Mm-hmm. Okay, so after they were taken in to custody, there was a search warrant sent out on their barracks. And inside of their barracks, they found flyers for the hi-fi shop. And they found a rental contract for a storage unit. Dun,
They
dun,
found
dun.
that under the carpet.
Yeah. The craziest thing, because
Right?
it was the one cop that stayed there longer, because he was like, there's something
something
in here.
We didn't
He's
find
like,
enough.
We have to stay here.
Uh-huh.
So they actually found it underneath the carpet, which is the strangest thing.
Yeah.
They tried to cover their tracks.
Right.
I'll give them that.
Right.
But they didn't do a very good job,
No.
because the cop was better at his
Good.
job. Thank goodness. So then they obviously got a warrant for the storage unit. And when they opened it,
Guess what they found?
$25,000 worth of stereo equipment.
Dun, dun, dun.
And so they matched the serial numbers to the stuff that was stolen from the hi-fi shop and matched it to Pierre and Andrew's, the stuff they found in the storage shed.
Right.
So there also was a third person in here. I don't want to get into too much detail about him. Brooke mentioned him. He was the getaway driver.
Mm-hmm.
All three of them were actually tried at the same time, and they all had the same
Lawyer?
No, what's against them?
Prosecutor.
No.
Charges?
Charges. They were all charged with the same thing, which was
Yes.
murder and robbery.
Oh.
And so, unfortunately for this poor Keith Roberts guy,
Right? Because he's like, dude, I just stayed in the van.
he had no idea what was going on.
Uh-huh.
Honestly, he was privy probably to the robbery,
Yes.
but not to the murders.
Right.
So
He's just like out in the van being like, hey guys, this is taking an awfully long time.
like, what is happening? Why would you stay? Is my
Right?
question.
Just
I'd be
leave.
like,
peace.
peace out, guys.
Right.
So I feel like his like prison.
Culpability.
Yeah, well, in his prison sentence, he could have got away with everything by just
Right?
leaving.
Yeah, right.
So it's just crazy. But during the trial, like I mentioned, all three were tried jointly. Even it's not even like a separate trial they did. Shelby and Andrews obviously were convicted on all charges and sentenced to death. Thank God.
Yes, they deserve it.
And Roberts was convicted of robbery and sentenced to imprisonment. I found many different articles. They all said different times that he was in jail.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
The only one I saw was 13 years that he was in jail, but he was sentenced to, I think, 20.
Yeah. And I saw 10. I saw 13.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so we'll say 13. That sounds good.
And he got the hell out of Dodge when
Yeah.
he got out. He was like, see ya, Utah.
Done.
We're
with
done.
Utah. I do not blame this guy.
Yeah.
He got himself into a rough situation.
Mm-hmm.
I would get out of here too.
Was he an airman too?
Yes.
Okay.
From what I found, yes. He was doing something.
He was
on the
also
base.
young. He was only
Yeah.
like 19 as
Yeah.
well.
All of them, 19, 19, and 21, right?
Yeah.
Were their ages.
Uh-huh.
Like,
Right?
why mess up your life?
I know.
Especially
Wow.
the followers, Andrews and
Roberts.
Roberts,
Yeah.
the poor followers with the rage maniac that they
Right.
decided to be a part
to
of
attach
this group.
themselves to.
Goodness. All right, so it was brought out in trial that Shelby and Andrews had every intention to kill everyone that they came across during the robbery.
Right.
We know this by now just by listening to the crime, as Brooke told you.
Yeah.
So during the time leading up to the murder, they were researching fun ways to commit murder.
Oh, that's
Fun
fun.
ways. And this is where that movie comes into
Because that's what I do
play.
with my friends.
I mean,
Think of fun ways
Let's
to kill
see.
people, right?
how
No, I don't
should
do that.
we kill the next person?
Right?
Like, I mean, come on,
A
guys.
bayonet was fun. Let's try something different this time.
A bayonet that you only can see the handle of.
Right?
Oh, Pierre.
Oh.
Oh, Pierre, you're too much for me. So yeah, this movie definitely gave them the idea, obviously, for Drano, Magnum Force.
Yeah.
Yep, and then from what I read, as well as Brooke, is they either brought it with them and they had every intention of using it on the victims, the Drano,
Right.
or they found it. I see both ways, but
Not that it changes anything, but I
No.
wonder if Pierre, because Pierre said himself that he saw it in the bathroom, but I wonder if he said that because he wanted to make it not premeditated murder.
right,
Like, oh, I just saw it in the bathroom and something snapped and I decided to feed it to them.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's weird.
yeah, it really honestly really is weird to like have that as something that you would use
Right.
on somebody. And this is the only case I've ever heard of.
Right. Where they use Drano.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, why?
And you know
Why?
I mean, I'm a spooky person and I've loved like spooky things my whole life. And I remember my mom telling me about this and I was probably in high school.
Yeah.
And I mean, young. Like,
yeah.
And I'm just like, Drano?
But why?
Oh.
And it liquefies things. If you know what it does to your drain, you
right.
dump it down and it liquefies stuff so it can go down your drain.
Right. It
So,
dissolves like hair
all of
and
that,
gunk and
yes, your esophagus, all the soft tissue. It's just turning it into basically soap.
Yeah. So it just slides down.
Oh.
Yeah.
So there's your letting you picture that in your heads.
Right.
So I'm glad I gave you that little visual.
One more thing though I want to talk about. So the prosecutor at the court.
Yes.
Yes, this is my awesome little tie into this case too, besides the fact that we're from Ogden. So the whoops, I just kicked something. The prosecutor in this case was Bob Newey, and he later became Judge Newey, and he married me and my husband. So he was retired when my husband and I got married, but he was a good friend of my grandparents. So he actually married us. So I'll have to dig out a picture of him marrying us. But how cool is that? And it's funny because I remember my mom saying, you know, Judge Newey I thought she was telling me he was the judge on the case. But and I was like, no, he was the prosecutor.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
I know, it really is interesting. So,
good job, Judge Newey. R.I.P.
Brooke said that she might drop a photo on our YouTube channel so you guys can see.
Right, so you can see him marrying us. Yeah.
Because
I have to dig out my wedding photos. It's on a disc somewhere, guys. I'm old.
A disc?
Like a CD.
Okay, that's better.
not a floppy disk.
I hear disc, and I'm like, man, you're aging yourself.
Right.
Oh, goodness. Oh my goodness. So, basically, we're going to move into like the aftermath of all of this because they were sentenced to death. Let's get into like kind of what happened from here. So, the NAACP wanted the death penalty overturned. They're saying that there was a lot of racial bias, which I'm not saying there's not, but there was overwhelming evidence against them as well. So, right. I mean, let's make sure that's out there.
They were also concerned because I don't know the statistics, but statistically, black men were more likely to be sentenced to death rather than life.
Yes. It's still true today.
Oh my God, 50 years later, guys, what are we doing?
It's still true. Yeah. I looked at that statistic and I'm like, how?
Right? That's crazy.
And little side note here, most serial killers are white men.
Yeah. And they're not sentenced to death as often.
Yeah.
That is...
white men.
Wow.
Like, almost all of them.
Yeah.
So, that's crazy.
That's true. You think of like Bundy, Gacy, Ed Gein,
Yeah, I mean, what the heck? So, there we are. That's where we are 50 years later after this happened.
Wow.
So... I mean, I feel like they had every right to put the appeal in. Not that I wanted them to get it overturned, but there was a lot of racial bias. There was one black man that was pushed through to the second round in jury selection. One.
Oh,
and
so the jury was 100% white.
And he was let go after that first round that he made it through. So he says, well, they were saying that he had some ties to the prosecutors. I can't remember. It was ties to one of the lawyers, and so they said that's why they cut him loose. But it was such loose ties that he's like, it was for sure because I'm a black man.
That's awful.
So, and he's
I mean, Utah is probably like, I don't know the number, but my guess is like 10% at the most.
Yeah.
Non-white.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So, not only were all the victims white, but all of the jury was white. The prosecution was white. The judge was white. So I get why the NAACP put in this appeal.
Well, and I don't know that they necessarily wanted him to be like, not executed either.
No, they basically were just putting in that they wanted it overturned and changed to life without the possibility of parole. In my opinion,
it doesn't matter where you stand on the death penalty. Yeah. Like, I honestly, wouldn't say I don't believe in the death penalty. Some cases I'm like, damn, he deserved the death penalty. However, someone having to live their entire life being, like, punished, like, tortured and just, like, really miserable in prison, to me, sounds better than just killing them peacefully, because they kill them so peacefully. It's like they're going to sleep.
So peaceful.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. So, yeah, I mean...
And they poured Drano down these people's
They should have poured Drano down their throat first.
Right? And then shot him in the back of the head.
Yeah. I mean, firing squad. Let's get it going.